Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Haitian American Museum of Chicago, or HAMOC's program, The Power of Oral Histories, Remembering and Recording Everyday Voices, featuring Dr. Courtney Pierre Joseph. My name is Carlos Bossard, and I'm the Executive Director of the museum. It's great to see you all here tonight. HAMOC's mission is to promote Haitian art, culture, and history in metropolitan Chicago and surrounding communities, nationally and internationally, through advocacy, education, and supportive services. Tonight's program is made possible in part by a grant from Illinois Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Illinois General Assembly. Thank you all for joining us for this exciting conversation. Before we begin, I would like to do some housekeeping and let you all know the format of tonight's event. To start, as you see on your screen, this program is being interpreted by two fabulous American Sign Language interpreters, Miss Sarika Metha and Rodney Laban. This is a pivotal moment for the museum as this is our first ASL accessible event. We are proud to bring accessibility to our programs and will be continually checking in to make sure that the interpreters are seen throughout the program. Secondly, all of you were automatically put on mute as you entered the room. Please remain on mute throughout the program. After the presentation, Dr. Joseph will ask for a volunteer to be a part of a practice oral history interview. If you're feeling up to it, make sure to raise your hand or unmute yourself at that moment to let us know you're interested in participating. Lastly, after the practice interview, there will be a Q&A session with Dr. Joseph, moderated by HAMOC's educator and grant writer, Ben Henderson. Ben has been with the museum for over 2 years now and actually wrote the grant that made tonight's program possible.
Oh, hello, everyone. My name is Ben Henderson, and I'm the grant writer and educator for the museum. As Carlos has stated, the Q&A will take place after the presentation. However, feel free to put your questions in the chat during the presentation for Dr. Joseph afterwards. During the Q&A session, all questions must be made through the chat to allow the ASL interpreters a chance to accurately sign them out. I will be monitoring the questions throughout the program and relaying them to Dr. Joseph. Now, it is a pleasure that I introduce Dr. Joseph, our friend and associate. She is an assistant professor at Lake Forest College. She teaches history and African American studies. She specializes in African American history and culture, Haiti, its diaspora, and women and gender studies, along with hip hop. Dr. Joseph has earned her PhD in history from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana in 2017, so she's a relatively newbie in the PhD field. She has spoken at numerous institutions and occasions, including at the DuSable African History Museum and the Illinois Humanities Festival in 2020. She's also working with the Haitian American Museum of Chicago to create the first oral history archive dedicated to the Haitian diaspora in Chicago. Dr. Joseph is currently working on a book tentatively titled The Disabled Diaspora, Haiti, Blackness, and Belonging in Chicago. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Pierre Joseph.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be introduced by two friends and associates, Carlos and Ben, this evening. Very excited to be here. And so I'm going to get started by sharing my screen. I hope you all can see it once I get started, and hopefully one of you is already pining to be the person who does the practice interview with me by the end of the presentation. So I'm gonna hit. Okay, so as Carlos mentioned, the title of my talk tonight, or the title of this workshop, is really thinking about the power of oral histories and how that's a way for us to both remember and record people's histories who often do not get recorded. So what am I going to do this evening? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what oral history is as a methodology, as a concept. I'll talk to a little bit about my journey towards oral history, something that was totally random, really. Talk a little bit about the archive that is being built that brought this whole project together, and then give you all some of my tips and tricks of things that have worked for me in the last 5 to 6 years since I've been doing oral histories. We'll do that practice interview and some Q&A. You can't tell I'm a teacher, so I really love, and a Virgo. So I like order. I like to let people know where we're going. So let's begin. So what is oral history even? It's a lot of things. The way that I teach it to my students and the way that I learned about it as a historian is that it's a way of doing history. That's the, non-fancy way of saying methodology, a way of approaching how you do history. And for some of you, they're probably thinking, do history? Girl, that's just names and dates, right? Like, what do you mean do history? But history is a practice. It's an art, and people come at it from different ways and use different sorts of mechanisms and tools to get at telling a history of a certain person, a certain time, a country, an event. Hell, there's a history of mustard, which I don't know if you knew that, but there's a history of everything. And so one way of getting at it is by talking to people, but thinking about it really as a multidisciplinary sort of thing. It is something that not only historians use, but anthropologists use oral histories, literary figures use oral histories, obviously journalists use them. And it's really been a way for feminists as they're recovering the stories of women, because don't forget, women were not deemed members of society in a way that would deem them to be written about or their documents to even be kept over time. That's one way that we're able to get at the histories of not only women, but other marginalized groups. And yet, oral history is something that historians really have wrestled with. So I'll take you back to the mid-1800s when people who do not look like me, and did not want me there, that's for sure, we're coming up with the idea of what does it mean to, again, be a historian? What does it mean to leave college or university with a history degree? And so they made it into a science in many ways. They tried to make history into something that was quantifiable, something that was in many ways based in one way of knowing and one way of doing. And that one way of knowing and doing history and writing history would become based on the archive. The archive, this idea of the written word being the most supreme way that historians, the best primary source, the most elite primary source that historians should use in order to truly know what happened in the past. And with that, the ideas of oral traditions and oral histories went away from the profession because they were seen as subjective. They were seen not as objective, not as something that we knew for sure it happened this way. I mean, you all know that even the written word, though, is manipulated. The archive itself is manipulated, right? It's not a static space. And just because something is written down doesn't mean that that is for sure the way that it happened. It's still one interpretation. And so with that, though, being what they were trying to work against, oral histories, again, were not seen as good enough primary sources to write accurate histories. Because memory, for example, is very faulty. Do I remember what I had for breakfast? Maybe. Definitely couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast maybe on December 28th of 2019. Memory of mundane things and memory of even things that are supposedly huge events are not trustworthy. And so to rely on them makes historians and other folks feel like, well, can we trust the way that somebody is telling the story is the way that it actually happened? But I argue yes, because oral history, and even if some of the details are fuzzy, they still get us to thinking about how people experience things. And as a historian of culture, as a historian of people, as a historian of societies, I care how people remember things. I care how they experience things and how it formed part of their identities, how it formed how they remember an event, even if the facts are not exactly as they may be lined up in the newspaper or in a letter or a government document. There's so much on this slide, but hopefully we will be able to share this later on with you if you would like more. But again, oral histories are things that people have been doing forever. Cultures, different societies globally, families, institutions, towns, cities, people remember what they remember typically through oral traditions. People have family stories that get passed down, generation to generation. And you have to wonder, why is such a story so important that it would continue to be repeated lineage-wise? What is being said in this story? Even if it's mythologized, right? Even if it's more grand than maybe what actually occurred, why does it become so grand? How do our memories of things interact with the present day moments? How do we understand that people have their stories and maybe they don't look again in the way that we imagine them always to look, or lines up again with the names and dates and the who and the what's and the wheres of history? Oral histories often get you at the why. Why did something happen? How did it feel? How did people experience it? So that's why I have, in looking at important scholars, the ancestors, the people who come before us are the ones who were originally employing oral histories. And then, as I said, for about, 100, 150 years of history becoming a discipline for students to study, we see it go away. It comes back in the 1940s with a historian named Alan Nevins, who starts to think about how the diaries and letters and memoirs of some of our politicians and some of our leaders may be good clues into writing histories about them. Now, these are not the letters that maybe are public. Now you're talking about more personal facing documents, remember? And for some, they were like, why would we want to do that? Why do we need to know how they were feeling necessarily in making these decisions? But Alan Nevins and others start to come and say that it matters just as much. Another huge historian that I'll have to shout out just for the Chicago pride is Studs Turkle, the 20th century Chicago historian, oral historian, who is remembered for chronicling the everyday lives of Americans living through some very tumultuous events, whether it's the Great Depression, into the Second World War, and everything that comes after it. They become the source base for his Pulitzer Prize winning book that comes out in 1984 called The Good War. And so Studs Turkle represents a historian who brings the power of oral histories back into the discipline and shows that they can be used as powerful sources for telling a history, as subjective and maybe as unreliable, quote unquote, as some people may think they are. One of the articles that I think has helped me inform the way that I think about oral histories is Rhonda White Williams' I'm a Keeper of Information. It comes out in 2001, I'm sorry. She's a historian of lower income Black women and marginalized people. And we have to remember that one of the main things that was kept from various marginalized groups around the world was literacy. the ability to read and write, especially when you're talking about the experience of chattel slavery in the United States, in the Caribbean, and South America. Those folks were not allowed to read. It was punishable for them to even learn or to want to learn how to read or write. And so how do we tell the stories of these people and their ancestors today, who again are often kept out of written documents or only represent a hash mark in a written document because they were considered property? How do we tell those stories? One way of them is to think about the voice of using oral histories and relying on ways and stories that have been passed down through these traditions in order to start to fill in some of those gaps. So how did I get here? Well, I get to grad school. I'm not. You should go to grad school. Okay, it's not right. I still have PTSD. I'm not anyway. How did I get here? Well, I started graduate school in 2010. Knew that I wanted a history PhD, have loved history since I was a child, really. And decided, okay, I found out that you could get a job just doing history, and you could get a degree doing history. Shout out to Eric McDuffie, my professor in both college and my graduate school co-chair advisor. Started graduate school, got excited. I'm sorry, I didn't get excited. It was rough those first few years, but I knew that I had to get to a point where I would pick a dissertation topic. An original idea for historians based specifically on one or two archival documents, a plethora of them. You go in, you study it, and you come out with an original research bookish. It's kind of a book. But mine was a book. So I found what I thought was going to be an archive. It was an archive about a Black woman in Chicago who was involved in both the civil rights movement and Black Power movement, but was also a reverend. And I was excited. I found it. I told my professors about it. It was going to go down. Very excited. Then I learned that somebody else had just written that exact same dissertation. And after I cried, I realized that I would have to find something else to focus on, and started to think about it and realized, hey, maybe I should do something about Haiti. Now, if I haven't outed myself already, I am the proud daughter of two Haitian immigrants to Chicago, and that has been formative of my identity forever. But it wasn't an object of inquiry in terms of studying it and in terms of making it a focus of some original research. And yet, as my mother likes to say, everything happens for a reason. I believe that the no led me down the path of the research that I started doing then, which was I wanted to focus on Haitian people in Chicago. I realized nothing really had been written about it, despite the fact that Chicago's origin story begins with a man of Haitian descent, that Chicago is a space that is first settled by a man from Haiti. How is that? And then there's Haitian people in the city. Today, how do we not have that story? And so I decided that I would do it. I would write it. My graduate advisors all looked at me and said, that sounds lovely, but where's your archive? What are you going to do? Who are you? How are you going to write this research when there's no archive that exists on this? And you should also know about me that when somebody tells me no, I really like to figure out a way to make it happen anyway. And so still I thought, okay, well, I didn't think I'm going to make an archive. I just said, I'm going to start doing some oral histories. I'm going to start interviewing Haitian people who I've known, my parents have known, that I'll do some outreach with some other folks in the community to see if I can create the documents and the archival information that I need. And I did. Between 2015 and when I graduated in 2017, I completed 30 oral history interviews, which became part of my dissertation research. Even then, though, after graduating, I still just thought, okay, this is lovely. I have these, they're going to help, and I want to keep doing them. I'm obsessed with them. And then I remembered about a museum that I had connected with while I was writing my dissertation, the Haitian American Museum of Chicago. I had walked in after doing some research about them and met this lovely woman who I'm pictured with here, Elsie Hernandez, who is the founder of the museum. She shared her oral history with me that day, and I decided, well, this is a partnership I'd like to continue. Maybe they can do something with these oral histories. Maybe this could be a way to make them more accessible long term. I knew that it was something that could work because in 2018, I had the opportunity, as I now am a professor, to work on a digital project that included embedding oral histories into the research and into the finished product, into a digital space that then people could hear the oral histories and use them and learn from them. I thought, well, maybe that's the way that we do this. And so I partnered up with my lovely friends and colleagues at the museum. And that is what we are working on now, bringing to life, which is our oral history digital archive collection, which I can't even believe every time I look and see my little name on this collection. I feel, again, super honored and super excited about what is to come. As I mentioned, I visited HAMOC at first as a graduate student. The picture actually on the last slide is when Elsie broke my heart and included me in an exhibit on the first Haitians in Chicago, and I received the honor of the first Haitian researcher. It's like the cutest thing in the world. Me next to Dusab and Kwame Rural Girl. That's not the same, but maybe it is now with this archive that we're building. We began working on this in probably late 2019, I would say, but really started to put it all together, put the team together and figure out how this would look in 2020. Even in the midst of COVID, we were still able to work through this and get the deeds of gifts and get the permission from all of the folks, because by the time we started working on the archive, I had a total of 60 oral history interviews. So between 2015 and 2020, I completed 60 of them. And so we reached out to the folks, asked them if it would be okay to make these more largely accessible so that other historians and other folks can go and listen into these stories, use them for research. They won't have to do what I did, which was basically build an archive for themselves. So I'm really excited about the fact that we're doing this. I know that Carlos is going to talk to you a little bit more about how to donate to the collection, which I really hope that you do. But before I do that, you're probably thinking to yourself, why would I do this? It sounded like you only did it because you had to. And that's kind of true. But I found that doing oral histories are a way to save our family stories, our friend stories, our people stories, hell, our stories for posterity, because people like to write histories that paint them in a good light and erase other people's stories, maybe to keep certain narratives out that make things seem more simple than they really are. I'm looking at you, 1776. What if we were to think about more and more the voices of people who are not readily accessible in our classrooms, whether we're kindergartners all the way through college students? And I believe that using oral histories for ordinary folks, everyday folks, their stories matter just as much as the ones of the folks who are maybe famous or, elected officials or made a business that now, is the conglomerate of the world. there are stories of people who matter. And so these are, I encourage all of us to think about how to save some of those stories, especially with the ways that technology has advanced, even in the 5 years that I've been doing them. But so here are some of my tips and tricks. If you want to do an interview with somebody, I would say first, ask them if you like, hey, I want to record some information about you. They're probably going to be like, what? But say I want to know more about our family or our history or this one part of your life. You'd be surprised at the experiences your family members have had, and people around you have had, and sometimes they just need an opportunity to share them. So come up with some questions, some things that you would want to know about them, but also know that they don't have to share their story with you. This is where I have the point about ethics, and something that I use is a consent form. And we talked a little bit about that a second ago when I was saying that once we were working on the digital archive, getting consent forms from the folks who donated their oral histories is really important, because people's stories are still precious. And sometimes people go through, not sometimes, if you live this life, there's trauma and there's sadness and there's sensitivity and there are things that people share with you that should be protected. And you want folks to feel safe, like you're not going to exploit their stories. Think about the, worst articles you've read. Think about the TMZ effect, even, for example. There's something exploitative about taking somebody's story and publishing it or misinterpreting it and putting it out there. And what can they do about that? And so it even speaks to thinking about how this extends to larger experiments that people think about, right? The Tuskegee Experiment being one historical example of the way Black people, Black men in particular, signed up for something and thought it was one thing and it was another. And it had very serious consequences health-wise for them. I think about oral histories, even though we're not doing necessarily experiments, it's still research based on humans and human behavior and human experience. And so you want to be ethical in thinking about that. So I use a consent form that I walk through with my participants beforehand. And I use the Illinois Review Board, which your city, state, usually has a review board that could help you if you're interested in doing this in a more public fashion. The other thing about oral history is it's a bit of a conversation. I think you may have noticed on an earlier slide the importance of listening. You want somebody to talk to you, and you're not Diane Sawyer, so you're not just like, tell me about what it was like in your childhood. And then you sit there, that's weird. You know what I mean? You're not a journalist, but you are taking in someone's story. And so you may remark upon it, and you may, have some moments where you're chatting with them. But remember that this is not your oral history. So there shouldn't be a moment that was like, man, that reminds me of my childhood. Let me tell you a little bit about it. So it's not about you. So you're doing more listening, more active listening, which I think is such an important skill that goes in so many different directions, whether it's relationships, at work, personally, family-wise, like active listening that doesn't require you to be prepared with a response all the time. This takes time. As I said, I've been doing this just about 5 into 6 years now. And the very first oral history interview I ever did, I didn't record it. I did it in my car. I wrote down notes. I felt very excited afterwards, and then realized I can't quote it necessarily. I don't have it's not saved for me in that way. And so I've learned and learned more over time, including the thing about testing your equipment. You want to make sure that everything's working. Otherwise, you will have not the recording that you're hoping for. And doing it twice is just not as fun. It's not as organic as you would hope. I have some additional resources listed here. I know that we will probably add them to the chat as well. But here are some other tools that I have used, some areas that I've used that have helped to inform how not only I approach doing oral histories, but how I teach my students as well to employ them in their own work. Right. So it is time to do a little practice one. I want to show you how it feels. You know, this is supposed to be a workshop, so I don't want this to just be, you know, me talking the whole time. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen, you know, and see who maybe wants to do this. It's going to be short. It will only be about 4 questions, but I want to give you an example of how I approach thinking about doing oral history. So, any volunteers? Don't be shy now. Being shy on this Friday night. We have one, Carlos.
Courtney, I can go.
Excellent, excellent. I see someone who is excited to take part. Can you, well, no, I'm not gonna have you introduce yourself. I'll do the oral history thing. Okay, it's only gonna be about 4 questions, but we'll see how I build up and then you kind of tell us how it felt. Sound good?
Yep.
Okay, so if you wouldn't mind stating your name, and the year that you were born and where you grew up.
All right. My name is Dominique Jeanvier. I was born in 1999, and I grew up in.
Is it good?
I grew up in Durham, North Carolina.
I just remember 1999 very vividly. So when you said that, I was like, facts. Okay. So you said that you're not from Chicago, correct?
No, I'm from Durham, North Carolina.
So what was growing up in Durham, North Carolina like?
It was pretty nice. You know, Durham is a very diverse city culturally, ethnically. So I saw, you know, a lot of people like me growing up. I felt really connected with the city. And weather-wise, it was nice. You know, it's the South. So really beautiful springs, hot summers. But it was a really loving, warm community.
That sounds good. That sounds like a nice place then to grow up and a positive experience for you. You mentioned the weather. I mean, it sounds beautiful. Why did you come to Chicago? What brought you to Chicago?
I came to Chicago for school. As great as North Carolina is, I was sort of looking for a way to get away, maybe travel a bit more. I felt a little stuck in North Carolina, so thought why not go to a big city, in Chicago. Sort of ended up being one of the places that I had choice to go to, and ended up being the place that I chose ultimately.
That's great. That's great. It's interesting. So there's so much I want to say, but I'm not going to do it yet because I'm following my own advice of listening. So being in Chicago now, how long have you been in the Chicagoland area?
Almost 4 years now.
Okay. So what would you say being a Chicagoan means to you?
Well, especially as someone who lives in the South Side, it means being very involved in the community. The school that I go to, it can often be seen as like a wall, very separate from the community. And so a lot of, personally for me, being a person of color, I want to make sure that I'm engaging meaningfully with the community and not necessarily being cut off. So yeah, I'm not, it's hard because I haven't been here for too long. So I don't really like claim being a Chicagoan. But definitely like Chicago is a piece of me now that I've been here for so long.
Dominique, thank you so much for that. That was it. That was my brief little oral history interview, but my oral historian mind was doing a lot as I
Okay.
listen to you talk about your story. So a couple of things that stuck out for me, the theme of community. You like to feel connected, to the place that you are. So you spoke about growing up in a community where you could see yourself racially, it sounds like, but also, just like comfort wise, it sounds like that's what you saw there. And you've been able to kind of find that in Chicago as well. So that if I were there to take apart your oral history and look for themes, which is what I would then do to use it as a document, right, as a primary source, I would start to say, this is something that's important to her. Why? And then I would start to kind of think more and look for other sources. If we were to continue the interview, I would probably add more deeper questions, because the thing about am I a Chicagoan was also a really important key thing that I would play with as I analyzed. How did it feel answering them?
I felt a little bit of pressure to like give good answers. Because I've done a few interviews, and so it's always frustrating when people give like really short answers and you have to sort of be on the spot thinking about follow-up questions. So I felt a little bit of pressure to give you good substantive answers. It's also interesting because people don't really ask these very specific, like, what is like growing up there? So that was really nice.
Both of those things are common experiences that I hear. People get very nervous when you tell them you're going to do an oral history interview with them. They're like, well, what's question 6? What do I say for question 6? And it's like, it's not a test, nor is it, again, an interview where it's just like, I just need to suck in your information the whole time. So talking to and kind of preparing the person beforehand that it's more of a conversation rather than like, you're sitting down again with Barbara Walters or Gayle King or something, not necessarily that same sort of thing. Your experience doing it before, though, it sounds like also helped to inform that. The second thing, people don't typically ask these questions, right? Like we kind of ask each other the same sorts of questions. How are you? How was your day? What's school like? How are you surviving in the panorama pandemic that won't leave our lives? But what does it mean to ask somebody a more pointed question and to try to have them to kind of think more specifically about their identity or how they're processing things? And I find what you experience is that people like that opportunity to maybe think on something differently, but also then to respond to it differently. So thank you so much for being our practice person. I'm clapping for you.
My pleasure.
So before I pass the mic to Ben for a Q&A section, I just wanted to do a couple of quick thank yous. Let me share my screen quickly. So I just wanted to thank the Haitian American Museum. It's absolutely one of my favorite things to work with you all. I miss coming, to Uptown to hang out at the museum and to soak in the city. So hopefully in a vaccinated future, but what a wonderful institution. And I am very happy to partner with you all on this. I want to thank my lovely research assistant, Desiree Brady, who is in her first year at Lake Forest College and has been a huge support for this project, as she is the one who has been updating the transcripts for the oral history archive itself. So thank you, Desiree, and she's here tonight. Sarika and Rodney, it has been a pleasure to work with both of you on this. I'm very happy that we're finding ways to make this more accessible. So thank you for your work. And, thanks to my Haitian folk, man, if it's for them, it's for Dusab and all the other folks, my parents, my community, and the ancestors, as I like to keep thinking about them. If you want to follow what I'm doing, I'm writing a book. And so you'll probably just see me complaining about how hard it is, but it's coming along. So thank you so much.
All right, so that presentation was wonderful. All right, so we already got one question in the chat. All right, so I'm gonna get started. Thanks for all this information, Dr. Joseph. I'm thinking a lot about the ownership of oral histories and how individuals and communities can retain ownership of their stories, both emotionally, how they get shared, and legally. Also, the difference of, I gotta scroll down, this is a long one. Also, the difference of collecting oral histories on projects like your dissertation and collections as part of an institution. Would love to hear your thoughts on this.
That's an excellent question. Thank you for that. So, ownership of oral histories is really important, which is why about half of the oral histories are not going to become public, the ones that I did. So I think the archive itself has about half out of the 60. We ended up getting permission to donate from half of those folks. And the place that I'm always coming with for oral histories is, again, that I'm asking for a gift, something precious, and that I want to empower the person who is sharing their stories with me to know that this is their story that they're sharing with me, and that if at any point during the interview they want to stop, they've decided against it, they want it to remain completely anonymous, they don't want me to share it with anybody else, I take that very seriously. And so that's a way that I try to think about ownership, is that I'm in many ways only, leasing these stories, but these are not my stories. Legally, that's where the consent form comes in. And once a year, I also do an updated form with the Illinois Review Board, who has a committee at the institution that I work with, the Human Subjects Research Committee, who every year I update and say, here's what I'm doing with the oral histories, here's the consent form that I'm using, et cetera, et cetera. And they put an eye on it to say that it's an approvable research project. And if there's anything, unethical about doing it, that's where that usually gets caught. Now that speaks, I think, to the second question that you have. I'm an individual working with a small, budding and growing and burgeoning institution, right? But we're not the Smithsonian. We're not the large institutions where now you're talking about, the larger something gets, the more kind of like hands get on it. And I think that's where sometimes folks get really concerned about giving oral histories to larger institutions who may have not feel as sensitive to these issues in the way that I'm talking about them. And so I think it's really important, if you want to do oral histories or bring them and have them in a larger audience, that you know and feel trusted and trust where you're giving them. That would be my suggestion. I hope that answered.
All right, we got another question. Can you talk a bit about collecting your oral histories during COVID? Have you done any, and how has it gone? What technologies do you use?
So I've only done one during COVID because I am a full-time assistant professor. And so that took most of my time in 2020. There was one oral history interview, though, that I did complete in 2020, and we used Zoom. It's interesting, though, because I used Zoom to record it, and then I downloaded the audio, and I used the program called Sonix, Sonix. It's transcription software, so that, back in the day, you just had to like listen through and type out a transcript for an oral history. Those were grad school days for me as well. I still shed a tear thinking about those nights sometimes, but there's software now with technology that allows for the audio to go and be transcribed, so it kicks out a written document. However, with all technologies, it's not perfect, and that's where having my lovely research assistant Desiree has come into play, because she's been able to listen to the audio and catch the inaccuracies and catch the areas that are incorrect for me so that I can go back and maybe, listen to them and see what was missed later on. The other in person, well, let me go back. The Zoom one actually was more difficult and we're having a little bit of a harder time getting the transcription to line up with the software. And so that one's going to take a little bit of time to edit differently than what I use as an app on my iPad that's called the Voice Recorder app. And it's where I've been using it, and it's been very helpful. But again, making sure it's all charged beforehand has been the most important thing.
We got a recommendation like Ellen Botkin-Levy. She recommends using their story for oral history collecting.
It's good to know. Thank you for that resource.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so there's no questions in the chat right now, so I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question myself. Okay, so how does something go from being considered a legitimate source to being not such a legitimate source? Because I remember in grad school doing research on early Civil War historiography. I was reading Dunning and James Rhodes and all that stuff. Those books felt very barren. I mean, James Rhodes outright says in one of his books on the Civil War that Black perspectives did not matter. Like, oh, they were just not meant to be there.
So I want to make sure you're finished with the question, Ben. You're saying legitimate versus illegitimate sources? Yeah.
Yeah. How does that go? How's that process works?
Yeah. So there's a history of this, right? That Leopold von Ranke, who was seen as, the father of history, is one of the ones who helps to pioneer this idea that the most legitimate sources are the written source, and that everything else it's not objective, it's inaccurate, and so it should not be utilized to tell histories. But again, what that did, and I mean, Leopold von Ranke didn't have to think about this because, his folks do have written sources. But if you're trying to talk about histories of people who do not have written sources, that's where people end up saying things, a combination of why and because they didn't feel like Black perspectives matter. This is tied to the racism, the bigotry, the various ways that people have been deemed illegitimate, even as citizens, right? And so if they're not seen as legitimate people, why would their histories be saved? But the way that, Black and Brown and various other marginalized and oppressed groups have pushed against that is via oral histories, to passing down these stories over time as a way to then still keep record of them, that could then be, utilized later, or at least to hold on to your own history. I think. Go ahead, Ben.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I thought you were done.
No, I was going to say, I think the move back to reclaiming oral histories as legitimate is still, fairly new, and it's still seen as like, well, you got to have that as backed up with the written stuff. So you can't just rely on the oral histories. You got to go and look at newspapers and other, again, written archival sources to make sure that it stands up. But I like to push the boundaries with that because, again, we know of written sources are still coming from one person's perspective. What gets saved and doesn't get saved is also really important, right? What people think is archival worthy versus what's not. I love documents that are technically maybe more personal, or, one of my favorite documents I've ever seen is a young Ernest Hemingway writing a letter to his friend. This is at the Chicago, it's at the Newberry Library, I'm sorry. They showed it to my students and I. when he's still going by Ernie. So Ernie Hemingway got his heart broken as a teenager, and he's writing to his friend about how his life is over, girl, and like he's never going to be the same, and like, you know, this woman just tore him up, and how will he live again? You're going to be Ernest Hemingway, like you're going to be fine. But to think about this moment in his life, that's like one kind of precious, you know, document that's more personalized. Oral histories kind of give me that same thing. Like you catch those like personalized, intimate ways of people experiencing history, not just written down history.
Yeah, that's pretty funny because like whenever I think of Ernest Hemingway, I usually think of that picture of him, the shotgun and all that stuff. Like,
you wouldn't know, right? But people
Yeah,
are people, you know,
Yeah,
and that's another lovely part of this is we get to think about when we do oral histories, we're thinking about them as full people. A colleague of mine just let me listen to the oral histories of W.B. Du Bois, who is one of my favorite, you know, scholars of all time. And I have never heard his voice. And so to hear his voice talking about his life adds a different dimension. Like you hear him, it's a different sort of interaction with the source that's not as one-dimensional.
Okay. Now we have time for one last question. Does anyone want to answer your question in the chat before we wrap things up? Okay. We got one from Jessica Sims.
Coming.
Okay.
As she's asking, I'll shout out another one of my favorite oral history collections, which are the WPA papers after during the Great Depression. Oh, that is a good question. So I'll just quickly say, during the Great Depression, President Roosevelt asked for oral history interviews to be done with the remaining people who were alive during slavery. And so about 3,000 oral histories were done with formerly enslaved people throughout the South about their experiences. And that is an absolutely fascinating source that, I mean, I have my students dive into so much, but some of them are recorded and there are pictures of the people, and then you have the written transcripts. So you can have access to those anytime. Do I find sites like Ancestry and 23andMe useful for you or the folks you interview? I did my ancestry test last summer because I had to know, and because I'm obsessed with Henry Louis Gates and want to be him in my wildest dreams. So I find them to be just another source, right? Like each source has its pros and its cons. So yes, Ancestry or 23andMe maybe fills in some of the bubbles of some of the history, but then, you know, they also have to be critiqued in the same way that, you know, like, are they 100% accurate? Nothing really is, I would say, in many ways. Everything, again, has a bias or some sort of bent or some sort of con or, you know, like con to it. And so Ancestry, 23andMe are one way, I think, to tell and add to a history of an event, but not the only way, for sure. But I do like using them, and mine ended up pointing out what I knew and was very proud of, that I came from the Afro-Haitian heritage. So, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Carlos here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. Dr. Joseph, an amazing presentation. Thank you for sharing your research and really the contributions that you are putting forth to the Haitian community here in Chicago. I am just listening to you, just made me smile the whole time. So thank you so much for being here, and always partnering with HAMOC. I look forward to your book signing in a vaccinated and safe COVID world, and we'll have that at HAMOC. We're super excited. Everyone here is invited. Also, a huge shout out to our ASL interpreters, Sarika and Rodney. I look forward to working with you both in the future to continue making the museum's events accessible to more individuals. Super, super important. And of course, thank you to our museum educator and grant writer, Ben Henderson. Another very insightful Q&A session complete. Thank you so much, Ben. Before we go, I do want to make some quick announcements. Right before the program started tonight, the HAMOC team uploaded 2 additional oral histories to the online collection. I'm gonna put the link in the chat right now, and I also will send it in a follow-up email. But go ahead, that is the, oh, wait. There we go. That is the link to the oral history collection. Go check it out, send us your feedback. It's really a fantastic collection. Right now, there are 4 oral histories up there. And again, Dr. Joseph mentioned there's about 30 of them that we have gotten permission to use. So make sure to bookmark the page, follow us on all our social media platforms to keep up to date so you know when more oral histories will become available. Also, this Sunday, February 21st at 2 p.m. Central Time, we are having a conversation with Dr. Cranston Knight on the geopolitical implications of the Rwandan genocide. Join us for that if you can. And then also this upcoming Thursday, February 25th at 7 p.m., HAMOC president and founder, Miss Elsie Hector Hernandez, will be a part of a panel discussion and celebration of Jean-Baptiste Pointe-du-Sable, the Haitian founder of Chicago. Again, thank you all for being here with us tonight. I'll send that follow-up email with some additional information, again, the oral history collection website, and some contact information so you can get a hold of Dr. Joseph directly. Be safe, stay warm, and we look forward to having you at one of our programs in the future. Thank you so much, everyone.